this all comes from a misunderstanding actually of the Belfast Agreement, a misunderstanding which unfortunately I have to say Theresa May was part of, because she decided that there couldn't be any sort of border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, essentially between Northern Ireland and the single market of the European Union. Whereas in actual fact, of course, there is a border, there's a currency border, there's a VAT border. The border has always been, well, it's been there for 100 years now. And the way to have dealt with this was to have actually said, we will use technology, we will use risk management, we will use the European Union's own work on smart borders to help us to deal with what is, and nobody denies that it's a tricky situation, but I think it could have been dealt with through what was known as alternative arrangements. And some of your listeners may remember that there was an Alternative Arrangements Commission actually set up to deal with some of these issues. And it was looking at trusted traders, for example, companies like Tesco and Sainsbury's that operate in Northern Ireland would have been trusted to have dealt with these issues in their very large companies and warehouses. And then to have small business exemptions for those tiny little companies, of which there are many in Northern Ireland, who have an integrated supply chain back into the rest of Great Britain. So there were a lot of ways in which this could have been dealt with. But unfortunately, when Theresa May and the European Union said there couldn't be any sort of border on the island of Ireland, that immediately started the ball rolling towards the Northern Ireland Protocol, and that's unfortunately the difficulty that we have now. I think the difficulty was that Europe, influenced heavily by the Irish government of the time, decided that the various alternative arrangements that had been put forward were quote-unquote unicorn solutions. They weren't going to work. It was untested and untried, and therefore they just dismissed it. And it's interesting now that people are looking at the prospect of having two lanes, if you like, one lane that deals with just Northern Ireland goods and don't need any checks, and then another lane for Republic of Ireland goods, in other words, goods going into the single European market. I'm speaking for the whole of the community, because of course it's not just DUP politicians that are against the protocol. There's not a single unionist politician in Northern Ireland that's in favour of the protocol. And just recently in a Belfast Telegraph poll, the Belfast Telegraph would be the mainstream publication in Northern Ireland. They conducted a poll which showed that 63% of unionists wanted it changed fundamentally. So I think that's an indication that actually we were sold the protocol, although I have to say I didn't buy it, Michael, that we were going to have the best of both worlds. In other words, we'd be able to sell into the European market without any problem, and we would be able to work within the United Kingdom single market without any difficulty. What we have instead is actually the worst of all worlds, because we have increased costs, we have less choice. A lot of our small businesses have now diverted their supply chains to Europe, and that is a fact that has been noted by our own government. And there's a lot of companies in England, Scotland and Wales that now don't supply into Northern Ireland, and that should be a matter of concern as well. I think there were alternatives to the protocol, and we were very clear with the Prime Minister at the time that he signed up for this protocol that it was going to cause no end of difficulties. Particularly, we met with the head of HMRC at the time. He was very clear that if the protocol was implemented in full, that it was going to cause real problems in terms of goods coming across from Great Britain. And of course, we should remember, Michael, that we're still in the so-called grace period for the protocol. In other words, only about 30% of the checks are actually in place at this moment in time. If the full protocol was operational, it would be much worse for businesses and the economy in Northern Ireland. And I think that is something that the government have realised. It's why we hear the Prime Minister say now that he finds the protocol, quote unquote, insane, and that it's Europe's pettifogging in terms of the operation of the protocol, and therefore it needs to be sorted. And I suppose the frustration for those of us who live in Northern Ireland is that the government haven't taken action to date. Back in July of last year, when Lord Frost was negotiating on behalf of the government, there was a command paper that was issued. And in that command paper, there was an indication that the conditions had been met for the triggering of what's known as Article 16, which basically calls time on the operation of the protocol, but that they wanted to seek an agreement with Europe. And I can understand that. Nobody wants to be in a situation where they have to use the emergency mechanism. But it's been acknowledged that the conditions exist for the use of the emergency mechanism for well over 6 months now, and yet we still aren't dealing with the issue at hand. Well, that's a very good point. And of course, there hasn't been any fundamental changes in the rules and regulations that Europe get very uptight about in terms of protecting their single market. So what essentially we've done is that we have fractured the single market of the United Kingdom in order to really say to the Europeans that we're protecting your single market in the European Union. And of course, it's completely disproportionate because the same rules and regulations that pertain in the United Kingdom are those that pertain in Europe. Geoffrey said in his quite a major speech, his big major speech since he became leader of the DUP back in September, that it was really a choice between the protocol and the Belfast Agreement. Your listeners will, of course, recognise that the Belfast Agreement was a multi-party agreement between the parties in Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom government, Michael, between relationships within Northern Ireland and relationships east-west and north-south. And what the protocol has done is actually fracture the east-west relationship insofar as it has put up barriers in terms of trade. And worse than that, it actually goes against the Act of Union of 1801. Because if you look at the Act of Union, which of course really the title deeds of the United Kingdom, it talks about unfettered trade between the different constituent parts of the United Kingdom. And at the moment, we certainly don't have unfettered trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and therefore unionists feel very sore about the protocol. There are protests taking place in Northern Ireland about it. And I think eventually Geoffrey Donaldson and the DUP came to the conclusion that they couldn't continue as First Minister of Northern Ireland whilst the protocol still existed, and therefore they have resigned the First Minister. And that means that the executive, the governing cabinet, if you like, in Northern Ireland can no longer meet. I think there's a number of issues. I think some of us believe, and indeed there was that unattributable comment that Northern Ireland was the price of Brexit, Michael, which you might have heard. I think it was a German official is supposed to have said that during the time that the negotiations were going on. And that is because, of course, other European nations are looking on to this, and Spain, which you will be very familiar with, will be watching very carefully as to what happens in relation to the Northern Ireland issue. And indeed, many other countries in Europe are watching carefully as well, because if they decide, you know what, we would like to leave the European institutions, they will find it, oh my goodness, look what happened to the United Kingdom and look what happened to Northern Ireland. And so they'll think twice about that. So we think that that is part of the modus operandi. Also, I think there is a fundamental misunderstanding about the Belfast Agreement in the European Union. And I suppose the huge disappointment is that our own government didn't right that misconception, because it doesn't, the Belfast Agreement, if your listeners would care to go and look at it, says nothing around the European Union, doesn't talk about the fact that there can't be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and actually recognises that for so long as the people of Northern Ireland decide that they want to remain within the United Kingdom, then that should be the case. And I suppose the worry for those of us who are unionists is that the protocol goes completely against that, and that's where the conflict comes between the protocol and the Belfast Agreement. For some reason, they had it in their mind that the Belfast Agreement meant that there couldn't be a border of any kind on the island of Ireland. But of course, there is a border on the island of Ireland because there are two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland. One is Northern Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, and one is the Republic of Ireland, which is part of the European Union. So to say that there can be no borders on the island of Ireland is just not right. The pulling out of the First Minister really truncated the life of the executive. The Assembly is still going on until the end of March, which is the time in which it would have been put into recess for the election in any event. So we're really only missing a month and a half in terms of the executive business. But I don't expect the DUP to put a First Minister back in place before the election, no. Unless, of course, the protocol is dealt with, Michael, and then they will be able to do that. We didn't agree with parts of the Belfast Agreement which we felt were wrong, such as the dismembering, if you like, of the RUC, the release of prisoners from our jail without having dealt with their full terms. There were accountability issues in the Belfast Agreement, which we would have liked to have seen dealt with. But we dealt with some of those issues in the St Andrews Agreement of 2006. And that then paved the way for the DUP going into government. You will remember in 2007, that's when I first became a minister. And I do think it's right that local people have a say in their government and actually were able to push ahead and advocate on behalf of their region. And I mean, I did that for many years as the Economy Minister of Northern Ireland. It was a great privilege to do that and to sell Northern Ireland as a place to come and do business in and to invest in and have a family and raise your children in. So I do believe in devolution, but devolution has to be balanced, Michael, and that was the whole point of the Belfast Agreement. And I think with the protocol, it certainly has got out of sync and it needs to be reset again. First of all, I don't know what their policy platform is. I would imagine it is that they will fight the election to become the largest party and to take on the role of First Minister. But more importantly, maybe even than that, the Justice Ministry as well goes to the party who is the largest. And of course, that is very important that that is held not by Republicans who have a history in Northern Ireland, and indeed it would be really very difficult for Northern Ireland if a member of Sinn Fein who has a record of violence was to be that Justice Minister. I think that that would be very, very difficult indeed. It has been a huge disappointment for those of us who have worked in the past with Irish governments that the Irish government of the time took a very aggressive approach. And I understand that they were upset that the United Kingdom had decided to leave the European Union. They were incredibly upset by all of that. But surely they should have foreseen that treating particularly unionists in this way would have led to the problems that we have today. I mean, anyone could have foreseen that that would have caused difficulties, and so it has proven to be the case. So I think that the Irish government, and of course there's been a change since then, and Micheál Martin is now the Taoiseach. I think Micheál is altogether more measured in how he deals with Northern Ireland, and I would hope that he would be a facilitator for trying to find a solution, because a solution has to be found so that the people of Northern Ireland can move forward. It certainly seems in the polls that they are continuing to sustain that poll lead from the two main parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. You will know, Michael, that both of those parties came out of the War of Independence. Both sides, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, were the two sides in that war, and they have been the main political parties in the Republic of Ireland since then. Sinn Féin has presented themselves as an alternative, as an opposition. They particularly target young voters who have very little memory of what happened in Northern Ireland for 30, 40 years. And as a result, they have been able to sell their left-wing ideology to those young people, particularly because there is a housing crisis in Dublin and in the surrounding areas. And they are gaining a lot of traction, as I say, with particularly young people. So unless Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael get their act together, frankly, we will be facing a Sinn Féin Prime Minister in the Republic of Ireland in the very near future. think it will have a huge impact on Northern Ireland because there will be a more aggressive strategy to seek a united Ireland. They will be pressing for that in a more meaningful way, despite the fact, as I say, that the greater number of people in Northern Ireland want to remain within the United Kingdom. And I think it will destabilise things in Northern Ireland as they press that goal ahead.